Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back Marc Nelson. He's a scientific researcher, and his latest Kevin MD article is titled The Rise of Spiritual Science, Uniting the Soul and Science. Marc, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you for having me.
So you've been on the show multiple times. For those interested in hearing about Marc's story, just go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Go to the search bar in the upper right-hand corner, search for Marc's name to look for his previous episodes. But I want to get straight into this most recent article about spiritual science. So give us some context, Marc. Before going to the article, what is spiritual science?
So, up until recently, most people think that science and spirit are two things that are separate, like oil and vinegar. They simply don't mix. We disagree. We look at spirit as something that's very real in terms of the soul. And we reference Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, who really is the pioneer of spiritual science. He began it in the 1960s, and he has vetted over 2,000 cases. He is now no longer with us, but in his time, he vetted over 2,000 cases on reincarnation, near-death experiences, and other perceptual phenomenon that mainstream science won't give any credit to, at least not until very, very recently. And so we are looking to expand his research and bring more credence to the idea that spirit and soul are very real. They play a valuable part in human health, along with the physical, mental, and emotional aspects of being human. And we are working on strengthening the spiritual science to bring forward that research data so that it is offered more credence in the world at large.
So you talk about the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. So what are some of the data and studies that he did? So talk about more about that background.
Indeed. So one of these studies, he went over to Asia, and there was a report of a young child who claimed that she remembered her past life, and he essentially went through and vetted out that case, went to the small village that she lived in, spoke with the people who she claimed to have known in her past life, etc., and he gathered all of the evidence and data. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily prove that her case was real or not, but all of the evidence added up to show that she likely could not have known about so much of what she was talking about. And so he basically went out into the world and found people who had stories about living past lives, and they knew things that they couldn't possibly have known otherwise. And he brought all of that evidence and those facts forward and documented those stories, and that's really the only thing that we can do right now in terms of bringing forward the evidence or facts, because we don't have the technology currently to further study what is the soul, what are the actual meridians, what are the chakras, what are all these variables that Eastern medicine has spoken about now for really thousands of years, that here in the West, we don't give much credence to because there is so little science on them. And the only reason that there is so little science is, one, we haven't looked at it because we haven't given it the actual credence. And two, our technology isn't advanced enough right now to actually go in and look at that. So what we are waiting for here at Fellow One Research is for our technology to grow to a point where we can begin to look at these variables in a new way using cutting edge technology. But Dr. Stevenson, with what he was capable of doing at the time, he went out into the world, he found people who had real stories about such things, and he did his best to vet it all, bring forward the actual evidence and facts, and he documented it at the University of Virginia as well as he possibly could with the technology and such that was available to him at the time.
So before getting to your article specifically, tell us, how was Dr. Stevenson's work received at the University of Virginia?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I would assume that because he was on the cutting edge, that he was probably not so well especially early on. I think that as he grew in his research data and more mainstream scientists came on board with what he was talking about, and he had the actual evidence and facts to show, I think that it became more accepted over time. But even then, I think that, again, because mainstream science is, I would say, against this idea that spirit is real, that it wasn't very well received. And I hope that that has changed, and we are, again, working on changing that. But I think that he probably met with quite a bit of ridicule and pushback in his time.
All right. You write more about that in your Kevin MD article, The Rise of Spiritual Science, Uniting the Soul and Science. Now, tell us, how did your article come together?
Well, we here sort of keep this on the down low because we are also ridiculed for the idea of uniting science and spirit. And so it was nice that you are open to this idea. So thank you for being open to it. And that's really what it inspired us to pull together all of the research. So that's what we did. We have gone out and looked at, there are universities and the National Institutes of Health have done research studies on meridians. So they are giving more credence to the idea that these things that, again, Eastern medicine has talked about for so long are actually very real. And so if we look at things like acupuncture and the research studies that are showing that the meridians are actually real, and that acupuncture can actually have a real effect on medical science and medicine in general, in terms of things like the chakras, which, again, we really don't have the technology to look at these things right now and verify if they are actually real or not. But with what little science has been done, what we did with this article is we went out and we found all the evidence that we could, and we summarized it in this article so that folks can at least get a sense that we're not just a bunch of quacks who are talking about crazy things. We're actually bringing forward the science as we know it now, which is very young. And again, because of our lack of technology and just the lack of research that has been done on this, there isn't enough science right now. And that's what we are looking at doing here, is strengthening that so that folks will give it more of a thought. They will look at this article, they will see all the evidence that we brought forward in it, yada yada. And I will also say that one of the most interesting things that we think is neat in that article is the 5,000-year-old man who was found up in the glacier. He was mummified, basically, but they found acupuncture tattoos on him. And what the evidence and research is showing is that they knew about acupuncture and the meridians 5,000 years ago. So this isn't something, again, that is just coming out of the blue now. We as human beings have known about this for a very long time. It's just only been given credence in the East, and we are hoping that we can change that here in the West.
So you mentioned meridians and some studies that the National Institutes of Health have done on meridians. For those who aren't familiar, what is a meridian? And tell us about some of the data and studies that the National Institutes of Health have been doing.
So the actual meridians are essentially like lines in the body that energy flows through. And if those lines are open and flowing well, then it speaks to health. And if they are clogged or jammed, it speaks to unhealth and imbalance in the body. And that's why acupuncture is actually showing to be a helpful and valid means of medicine. And what the research at the National Institutes of Health are showing is that, one, the actual meridians are real. They actually do exist in the human body. And by doing the actual research and looking at, if we put an acupuncture needle in here or there, does it actually have an effect on the human body? And what it's showing is that it actually does have an effect. We don't really understand right now how well or what that effect is, but just the fact that it has an effect on the human body shows that there's something real there that is worthy of being studied further. When an actual acupuncture needle was placed in a place that was supposed to be quote unquote clogged or jammed, it would open it up. And again, at this point, we don't really understand the meridians in general well enough to know what that really means, what it actually affects. There's still so much more science that we need to bring forward and do. But just the fact that the NIH is allowing research dollars to be spent on this, and that the research that we've done so far actually shows that there is an effect in terms of the acupuncture needle relative to where we think the actual meridian is, shows that there's something real there that deserves further research study. And aside from that, I can't really speak further on it because, again, the science is so young and we just don't know. But I think that that is a very valid thing, that we have research that shows that when we put a needle in here and it has an effect of unclogging something, or it has some effect in general, that shows that that there is a realness there that should be studied further.
Now, for those clinicians who may be listening to this and are a little bit skeptical, why is it important that they should know that spiritual science potentially is real?
Well, for a scientist who believes in the soul, a human lifetime is way too complex and complicated to learn what we should be learning in terms of human beings in just one lifetime. And we look at the human body as a vehicle that the soul lives in while it's here in this lifetime. And it's something that grows through time. The soul is something that grows through time. So if that's true, if the soul is something that is real and separate from the physical human body, and it actually learns and grows through lifetimes, then that can explain why there are people out there like Dr. Stevenson who found, real human beings who speak of past lives or other lives where they were here or there and they had learned this or that, and now they're in this life and they have experiences in this life that are affected by that life. There's a cause and effect relative to one life to another life, and all of that affects the soul in general and human health. So one example that has been looked at is you have some people who have odd scars, and some of them claim that in their past life they were shot, or in some way that scar is directly relative to a wound that was actually received in the previous life, which can cause trauma, etc. So if the soul is real, if it does move from lifetime to lifetime in its learning, then it has an effect on that lifetime and into other lifetimes, and that can affect our health, yada yada. So there's so much here that it would be nice if we had the technology and the science to actually say, is this real or not? Is it just in people's heads, yada yada. But we think that it's valid. We think that so much more research should be done on it, and that's our goal here, is to actually find ways to do the actual research to bring all this forward.
So, talk to us about some of this research going forward. What are some of the directions this research is taking? What are some of the other major medical institutions like the NIH and universities that are devoting resources to this area?
So our body type science goes hand in hand with understanding not just the physical, mental, and emotional aspects of being human, but we are looking at the soul and the meridians and the chakras relative to body type science. So if the chakras and the meridians are real and they exist in the body and they play a part in terms of the human energy system, which includes the nervous system, then it would make sense, it would correlate that if there's a part of the human body that is lacking genetically developed muscle and muscle mass, and that's directly relative to the chakras and the meridians, that all that would have a cause and effect. So say for someone like me who has lacked muscle and muscle mass in my stomach area, if there is a chakra in that area, which Eastern medicine claims that there is, that would have an effect on the chakra relative to the actual muscle and muscle mass and the skinny fat and all the other variables that go into being human. So all that would correlate if all these things are real. And our goal is to begin to ask the actual questions, about that, about the actual gut feeling, and not just the gut, but everywhere else in the body where there are claimed to be chakras and meridians, etc. So we would like to begin asking the actual questions that would help better understand those actual variables and correlations. In terms of other institutes, you have the Max Planck over in Germany, who gives credence to all this, and they are actually looking at all this. But unfortunately, aside from the universities and the NIH and the Max Planck, right now, that's really where this is limited to, because again, so much of mainstream science and medical doctors just don't give credence to any of this. And that's our ultimate goal, is to open this up, give more credence to it. And the only way that we can do that is by bringing forward that science. And we are working on the grant funding so that we can begin to ask these actual questions. And right now, we don't know of any new technology that would help out, but our eyes and ears are open in terms of any new technologies that can help with this. And that's really where we are going with it.
Now, assuming that we do get the data and as science progresses forward, how do you envision spiritual science to be incorporated into contemporary exam rooms today?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not even sure if I've thought that far ahead, because there's such a version to all this. But I think it would be wonderful if, when you go in and see your doctor and they ask you all of the typical questions about your physical and even mental and emotional health, that they begin asking about spiritual health. And even if that starts with, do you believe in the soul? And if you do, what does that mean? I certainly do hope that once we have more data and once it's taken more seriously by mainstream science and medical doctors, that we find a way to properly incorporate it into the day-to-day healthcare of the average person. And that would be one of the things that we will most certainly focus on once we get there.
And my final question, Marc, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Well, one, thank you for having me on. As a spiritual scientist, I know the rigors of the ridicule that comes with being such. And for those of you out there who have experienced the same thing, we encourage you to come forward. Go to the fellow1.com website. We have multiple articles on spiritual science. You can comment at the bottom of them. You can go to the article on kevinmd.com and comment on that article. Please come forward and tell us your stories. The more people that can come forward in a scientific way and tell us your story and help document more stories like Dr. Ian Stevenson did, the more that we grow this and the more credence that we can offer to it. And that's really how all this works. So, yeah.
Marc, thank you so much for coming back on the show, sharing your time and insight.
Thank you for having me, Doctor.